Judge's Corner is brought to you by CoolStuffInc.com and GatheringMagic.com. Support our show by visiting both websites. Now it's time for Judge's Corner with David Green.
Welcome back to Judge's Corner. Today, we're going to take a look at Double Strike and how it works. So what is Double Strike? Double Strike is pretty much First Strike on steroids. Okay, so what is First Strike? First Strike is a keyworded ability that means whenever this creature would deal combat damage, it deals it before other creatures in a damage called the first damage step. Creatures with First Strike or Double Strike deal damage in this step, and then regular creatures or creatures with Double Strike deal damage in the normal combat damage step. Double Strike is just like First Strike, only you get to deal damage in the first damage step and in the second damage step. So let's take a look at our first example. So here we have a Wrecking Ogre attacking and being blocked by a Centaur Healer. The Centaur Healer will be dealt 3 damage in the first damage step and be killed before we reach the second. The Ogre's 3 damage going into the second damage step won't be dealt to the player because it was already blocked, but won't really be dealt to anything else because there's nothing there to deal damage to. In a similar example, our Wrecking Ogre attacks and is instead blocked by a Master Biomancer. Here, the Ogre will deal 3 to the Biomancer, but the Biomancer won't die yet. But in the normal damage step, the Biomancer will deal 2 damage to the Wrecking Ogre, and the Ogre will deal 3 damage more to the Biomancer, finally finishing it off. And then finally, we have our Wrecking Ogre attacking and being blocked by a Silver Claw Griffin. In this example, both creatures will deal 3 damage to each other in the first damage step, and then they'll both be killed off before we ever reach the second damage step. So, now that you've seen how Double Strike can work, let's take a look at some common misconceptions. So the first misconception would be, what happens if my Double Striker receives Double Strike or First Strike through a card like Aerial Maneuver or Boros Charm? Well, multiple instances of Double Strike or First Strike on a creature with Double Strike are redundant, and the creature doesn't receive anything like Super Strike or the kind. Then, what happens if a creature with Double Strike ends up fighting another creature through a card like Pit Fight? Well, Double Strike only applies during combat damage, and won't be much use to the creature in the Pit Fight. A few other things worth mentioning are, what if my Double Striker or First Striker deals damage in the first damage step, and then loses First Strike or Double Strike before we deal regular combat damage? Unfortunately, your First Striker won't get to deal damage again, and neither will your Double Striker because they no longer have those abilities, granting them the additional damage dealing properties. But when the game looks and sees if they've dealt damage already, they have, so they don't deal damage in the normal damage step. Also, what if my creatures all attack and one of my First Strikers deals damage, and before we reach the normal damage step, one of my creatures gains First Strike or Double Strike? Will they deal damage in the normal damage step? Actually, they will, because just as the same rules say that they can't deal damage, the same rules also say that they can because they haven't yet dealt damage in the first damage step, and the creature is still waiting to deal damage. So let's take a look at the interaction of Double Strike and Lifelink now. So here we have an Ajani Sunstriker attacking with Lifelink and being blocked by a Walking Corpse. Before damage, we give the Sunstriker Double Strike with Boros Charm. When we deal damage in the first damage step, we'll gain 2 life through Lifelink and kill the Walking Corpse. But then when we get to the regular damage step, we won't gain any life because we're not actually dealing any damage to any creatures or players here. Although, that changes if our creature has Trample, because then we'll be able to trample over for 2 when the creature is no longer there, and gain an additional 2 life. Speaking of Double Strike and Trample, you can find out a little more about the interaction of these 2 abilities by clicking a link off to the side, which shows our very first episode covering the 2. In addition to the example above, where our Ajani Sunstriker gets Double Strike and Trample, we have another example where our Gore Clan Rampager is attacking and being blocked by our Riders of Gavony naming Beast. Here, we'll give our Rampager Double Strike with Boros Charm, and when we go to assign damage in the first damage step, we'll assign 3 damage to the Riders and 1 damage to the opponent, and the 3 damage on the Riders will get prevented. Then, in the normal damage step, we'll do it all over again, assigning 3 damage to the Riders once again, and 1 damage to the opponent, and then our Riders will deal 3 damage to the Rampager as well, netting us 2 damage to our opponent. So, this concludes our episode on Double Strike, but before we go, let's take a look at a question brought to us by G-Man. So, G-Man asks, do Exalted bonuses go on the stack? That is, if you have more than one Exalted bonus, do they get added one at a time? So, to answer that question, yes. If a creature is attacking and you have multiple creatures with Exalted, maybe through Sublime Archangel, each one of your creatures that is given Exalted through Sublime Archangel will trigger and go on the stack independently, each individually giving your attacker +1/+1. So remember that if you have any questions, to send them to judgescorner@gatheringmagic.com. And until next time, remember that 3-for-1s are awesome, but 2-for-1s are just as good. And have fun.